Life is drudgery. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle. They come to an end without hope. Remember that my life is like the wind. I shall not see happiness again. These are the uplifting and inspiring words we hear in our first reading today in the book of Job. So there you go. I'll end there. Just kidding. And of course, when we heard those words, we all said, to the word of the Lord, thanks be to God. Our days are without hope. Thanks be to God. So Job is an interesting little book because it wrestles with a lot of deep questions and challenges a lot of the common perceptions that people had especially about God and about suffering. And especially this reoccurring and persistent false idea that those who God really loves and favors, he will give much prosperity, wealth, and minimal suffering. Kind of a happy, comfortable life. And thus, inversely, this idea that if God doesn't love me, well, then I suffer more. Or, if I'm suffering, another way to say it, if I'm suffering, it's because God doesn't love me or doesn't care about me. And unfortunately, even these ideas carry over into modern day. There's various versions out there that exist of the gospel that people preach in a way that basically, if you really trust in God, he will materially bless you with much wealth and material good. But this little book of Job flips all that on its head. That Job invites us to dwell in the tension of this question of God's goodness and the suffering of the innocent or the righteous. And this book is classified as a book of wisdom. That there's no clear, easy answer to this tension, but somehow wisdom is found by dwelling in this tension, in this place without easy answers. So Job is righteous and innocent before God, as we probably remember the story, and then he loses everything. And so his friends come to him and is faced with this challenge or this question. If God is good, why are you suffering? And by the way, when this happens, when Job loses everything, his wife comes with very comforting words, and she just says, just curse God and die. It's like, oh, wow, what an inspiring woman. I wouldn't want to meet her. And then Job's friends come and sit with him, which is good, but then they try and tell him, well, you must be suffering because you must have done something wrong. God must be punishing you. And the answer to the book is basically no. Job is innocent, and yet God is good. So we hear the words of Job as he wrestles with this seemingly meaningless suffering, this misery, and he seems to fall into despair. And the end of the book of Job, God reveals himself and gives this answer. And the answer is, I am God and you are not. Except God says it a lot more eloquently in a lot more words. Essentially, God points out to Job that he's approaching a mystery. He's trying to wrap his head around this thing that is so much bigger than him. God says, were you there when I unfolded the universe and made the sun to rise? Were you there when I parted the waters and made the oceans? And were you there? And are you aware or attentive to all these creatures that you never think about, that you don't even know exist in the depths of the ocean? Were you there when the wild deer gives birth to its child? No, but I am. And I'm attentive to all these things in the universe that I have a reason for. You simply have to recognize that you approach a great mystery and still hold that God is good. In some ways, this gives an answer. But it also leaves us a little bit, with something left to be satisfied. But in a way, then, for us as Christians, we see the person of Jesus Christ as the ultimate answer to the question in Job. That Christ is God incarnate. God who comes down and walks among us and experiences our human experience, including entering into our suffering, our experience of suffering, of struggles, of death. And God of his own will limited himself to enter into that experience with us, to enter into death, and so to show that there's also life on the other side. That Jesus gives us the answer. That somehow the answering is in this person of Jesus. I remember when I was in college, I was faced with learning a lot about sort of the suffering of the world. Of course, I knew the world wasn't a great place. But then in college, we started studying things like the Holocaust in Nazi Germany and various cults where crazy things happened. And we went on service trips, and I came face to face with the poverty of the world. Sort of an in-depth look at the suffering, the misery of the world. And I remember really wrestling with that question. And what does our faith have to do with this? What does Jesus have to do with the suffering of this homeless guy on the street who's lived this rough life? But as I was wrestling with this and praying, I remember looking at an image of the crucifix, of Christ on the cross, and realizing that somehow, in some way, even though I don't fully understand it, somehow the answer is there. With Christ crucified, Christ on the cross. Christ who enters into our suffering, who comes and dwells with us and sits with us, who speaks the words of encouragement and hope, who gives us his teaching of how to live by, because sometimes we need that in our suffering. But sometimes we also need someone just to be with us in our suffering, in our dark place. And that God also does that in the person of Jesus. That Jesus is the Word made flesh, the Word spoken into our darkness, the Word of encouragement and hope, and the act of being with us. So do we really believe that? That Jesus ultimately is the answer to the deepest longing, the yearnings of our hearts, and the brokenness of the world. Especially you, confirmandi, preparing to receive confirmation today. That you are posed with this question. Do you believe that? That Jesus is the answer? It's easy for us to look at sort of religion, faith, church life with various mentalities. Like, say, the consumer mentality. That we simply see this as, something I come and if it's a decent product, if the music's okay and the homily's decent and I learned something and not too long-winded, then, maybe I'll stay here. Otherwise, if I don't like the product, I'll take my business elsewhere. Sometimes we approach that way rather than looking at this being a community that we're a part of. Or that sometimes we look at church merely as a social club. That's a thing I belong to, but it's just as good as all these other things I'm a part of. Or that we look at it as, just one non-essential option among many. It's not that important. It's just as good as all these other options. It's just one and one I happen to like. But rather, our faith calls us to none of these mentalities. Rather, to something deeper. To this understanding or the question, do we really believe, rather, that what we have here in our faith in Jesus Christ is revealed through the church, that here is the answer to the deepest questions of the human heart. The answer to the brokenness, the struggles, the yearning, the searching of the world. Because believe me, people are searching. They may or may not be here in our pews. But you look at the world and what we've gone through in 2020. And if there's a silver lining in all of this, I think it's exactly in the shaking up of the world as people recognize their own search more than ever. So do we believe that what we have here truly is the answer to that? Not necessarily that I have the full understanding of it or that I live it well, but that somehow here in the person of Jesus Christ and the fullness of what he came to reveal in and through the church, do I believe that what we have here is the answer?